usual, I've prepared the session in a paper that it makes it easier for me to share the knowledge with you rather than fumbling with a unprepared speech. So as Nada announced, chapter 13 is called, Commentary on the 12th chapter of the Revelation of St. John. This chapter is also called Apocalypse. Preparing half of this paper on that commentary required reading of the Bible passages as explained by Abdu'l-Baha, then attempting to create thoughtful words on the subject. Staying with that stance for many days eventually led to the obvious, that it is much easier for the listeners of my ramblings to just read chapter 13 themselves in some answered questions. Abdu'l-Baha covered so many aspects of the, shall we say, picturesque prophecies of St. John that readers would readily accept the truths of Abdu'l-Baha's divinely endowed power of interpretation. I use the word picturesque as one can envision the characters and scenes of this biblical chapter 12. It is helpful to listen to the first 6 verses of chapter 12. It is one paragraph in my Catholic Bible. And a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon was under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And being with child, she cried out in her travail and was in the anguish of delivery. And another sign was seen in the heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his head 7 diadems. And his tail was dragging along the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and it dashed them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bring forth, that when she had brought forth, he might devour her son. And she brought forth a male child, who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, that there they may nourish her 1,260 years. This paragraph has always fascinated me for years because of the 2 particular descriptive figures within it, the woman and the dragon. Before we discuss them, let's take a look at biblical records. The Old and New Testament are the source material for Judaism and Christianity. Adherents of both those faiths, through years of attempted interpretation, have tended to try to fill all prophecies into their faiths. Taking that stance, they continue to wait for the fulfillment of prophecies, or at best, some understanding of them. The believers of God's latest religion, the Baha'i faith, are aware of fundamental truths of their faith, including that all the prophecies have been fulfilled, and that previous holy books are replete with expectations wrapped in mysteries and symbols that only the promised Spirit of truth can explain. We might interject here the repeated truth that the mystery of the Baha'i faith is Abdu'l-Baha, who was gifted with the interpretive abilities from the long-expected Spirit of truth, his father, Baha'u'llah. Thus, the fascination I experience in respect of the woman and the dragon is Abdu'l-Baha's authentic interpretation flowing from his mouth as easily as crystal water from a tap. an exiled prisoner from the age of 8 or 9, unversed in worldly schools and books, to be, next to his beloved father, the smartest person on earth. For they had access to all knowledge, regardless of the field. In interpreting the first 6 verses of St. John chapter 12, Abdu'l-Baha speaks of, among other subjects, the law of God, Muhammad, and the Bab. Little did the scribes of biblical prophecy foresee God sending yet other faiths, and that those 2 particular prophecies of the woman and the dragon were to be fulfilled by the next major religions to follow Judaism and Christianity. Let's briefly look at the above 3 and what Abdu'l-Baha explained. The law of God, Muhammad, and the Bab. Abdu'l-Baha says that the law of God has symbolic names. 3 are the holy city, the New Jerusalem, a bride. The woman, a bride, of St. John is the law of God as descended upon Muhammad. Her description is one of those 2 personal fascinations. When I would visit my local Catholic church as a child and young adult, I would pray before a statue of the Virgin Mary, depicted with the sun behind her, the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars, as stated in the biblical prophecy. Abdu'l-Baha explains their symbolism. The sun and moon represent 2 nations that the law of Muhammad affected. The Persian kingdom, with its emblem of the sun. The Ottoman Empire, its emblem being the moon. The 12 stars represent the 12 imams of the Shiite sect of Islam, whom Abdu'l-Baha said were the promoters of the Islamic law. Now to my second fascination, the dragon with its 7 heads, 7 diadems, and 10 horns, an improbable physical creature, yet believable and expected by the literal. Even my Catholic Bible has a drawing of the dragon in chapter 12, with parts of the dragon under the feet of conquering angels, but not the whole dragon. I did see some horns and crowns on beastly heads. The 7 heads and 7 diadems, crowns, are the countries ruled by the Umayyads. Umayyads. I looked it up on internet how to pronounce that, who dominated the Mohammedan religion. Abdu'l-Baha named the 7. The Roman dominion around Damascus, the Persian dominion, the Arabian dominion, the Egyptian dominion, the dominion of Africa, which Abdu'l-Baha said it meant Tunis, Morocco, and Algeria, the dominion of Andalusia, which is now Spain, and finally the dominion of Transoxiana. The 10 horns, Abdu'l-Baha stated, were the names of the Umayyad rulers. The dynasty had many rulers, but if you didn't repeat their names, it amounted to only 10. Can we not picture in our mind Abdu'l-Baha giving of his tired hours, expounding the accurate and reasonable interpretation of a long-expected Bible-described creature? Can you not see him facing the questioner, Laura Barney, and sharing historic facts like a university professor tutoring his students. Now, the paragraph-long quotes that the woman was with child and cried out in her travail and was in the anguish of delivery. Women can relate to the act of being with child, for they know the pain and suffering of carrying and giving birth. Abdu'l-Baha explains that this is what happened to the law of Muhammad. It suffered greatly to bring forth the perfect offspring who would be the Bab. The woman, the law, fled into the wilderness, meaning the fast desert of Hejaz. All you Persians have to forgive me. We Americans are terrible with these Eastern names. Meaning the vast desert of Hejaz and the Arabian Peninsula. Wikipedia says that Hejaz is significant for being the location of the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the first and second holiest sites in Islam, respectively. Our biblical quote also reports that the woman was nourished 1,260 days. We Baha'is are very familiar with this part of that period of time, the fulfillment of which is the year 1,260 in the Islamic calendar, 1844 in the Christian calendar, and the beginning of the Baha'i calendar with the coming of Bab. He relates the 1,260 days, each representing 1 year, with other biblical prophecies, adding up to that same 1,260, thus 1844. He speaks of the proofs, this is Abdu'l-Baha, being evident and conclusive, and its believers blessed with understanding. What about the unbelievers of this truth? Abdu'l-Baha said, but failing justice, the people attack, dispute, and openly deny the evidences, like the Pharisees who, at the manifestation of Christ, denied with the greatest obstinacy the explanation of Christ and his disciples. Now the red dragon was waiting to devour the child, meeting those Umayyads, fearful of losing their powers. Abdu'l-Baha explained that they were always waiting to take possession of the promised one. They knew, for example, that he would be a descendant of Muhammad. One of the privileges of being a descendant was the wearing of a green turban. You will remember Mullah Hussein's first meeting with the Bab in Shiraz, May 23rd, 1844. From the Dawnbreakers, page 52. On that very day, a few hours before sunset, whilst walking outside the gate of the city, his eye fell suddenly upon a youth of radiant countenance who wore a green turban and who, advancing towards him, greeted him with a smile of loving welcome. The Bab was later to send that turban to Mullah Hussein when that first letter of the living was in Mashhad defending the new faith, accompanied with a message beginning, adorn your head with my green turban, the emblem of my lineage. Thus, after 1,260 years, the woman gave birth to a male child who was the Bab, and that the iron rod that he would rule with is a symbol of power and might, not a sword, but a divine power. Let's take a moment to look at Abdu'l-Baha's opening answer in our chapter 12. He was asked to comment on chapter 13 of Some Answered Questions. He was asked to comment on chapter 12 of the book of St. John, but he began his answer with chapter 21. I thought, oh, the book has reversed 12 and 21. No mistake was made. Chapter 21 is where St. John says that he saw a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem coming down from God, prepared as a bride. Of this, Abdu'l-Baha explained that there was an old earth and an old heaven, meaning the former law. Otherwise, there wouldn't come new ones. We know that the physical city, Jerusalem, is made up of stone and mortar. It did not come down from heaven. The old Jerusalem that came down from heaven was the law of God. Thus, the new Jerusalem St. John saw, descending from heaven, would not be of stone and mortar either. It would again be the law of God. Look how Abdu'l-Baha, without a physical Bible in his hands, is able to answer chapter 12 by beginning with chapter 21, setting the listener up to understand the station of divine law. Now, there are other explanations for those 6 verses, but Abdu'l-Baha doesn't go into them in any detail. Now, chapter 14 of Some Answered Questions. This is an altogether different subject from the first chapter 13 assigned me. It is entitled Material and Spiritual Cycles. To begin with, let me speak of one of the original 9 members of the Universal House of Justice, Ian Semple. He is a Britisher. He's now deceased. Mr. Semple received his university education from Oxford in England and specialized in language. On occasion, he would share tidbits of the subject in respect of the sacred writings of the Baha'i faith. One formal presentation on language and scripture that Ian gave took place in 2001 when he and his wife Louise were on holiday in America. Here is part of Ian Semple's presentation. Language is a poor thing when compared to what God wants to tell us. If you try to put yourself in the place of a manifestation of God, coming to this world with the knowledge that's needed to take mankind forward a whole 1,000 years in its evolution, and then having to explain that to people in their own language. It wouldn't help to use another language because they wouldn't understand a thing. So he has to use the tools that we can benefit from to convey these incredible truths to us. And he does it with the greatest divinely guided skills one can imagine. So we must be aware of wishing that he be more simple. One of the tools that God gives to his messengers, his manifestation, is symbolism, the use of things that mankind has knowledge of and can relate to. They are linked to scriptural principles and truths to aid in our understanding of them. It is not a new tactic of literature, religious or secular, but perhaps it originated in Holy Scripture. After all, in the book of Genesis, the words of the beginning of creation are all symbolic. Otherwise, it would clash with reason. Very, very often, the use of things we know come from physical reality, from nature. So it is with chapter 14 of Some Answered Questions. Abdu'l-Baha uses the sun and the seasons to explain cycles in our material and spiritual lives. First, he speaks at length of the seasons of the material world. Certain we know that seasons are cyclical. Beginning with the vernal season, spring, he describes it to our mind's eye: rain-laden clouds, mild weather, black earth clothed in grass he describes as an emerald green carpet. The life of the phenomenal world has been renewed, refreshed. That which has been asleep has been awakened. Next, Abdu'l-Baha brings up summertime. The heat intensifies, adding fuller power to growth. Fruits and crops appear, and the harvest time will soon arrive. Then comes autumn. All things wither, the air becomes hard and chilly, the soft breeze of springs becomes the blast of fall. Finally, the cycle ends with winter, with its cold winds, snows, and storms. It is as if all nature has faded and died. Abdu'l-Baha goes on to explain in one paragraph that when this stage is reached, the life-giving springtime return once again, and a new cycle is inaugurated. And ends that paragraph with, the very existence of things must ever depend upon and be perpetuated through these cycles and successions. Such are the cycles and revolutions of the material world. Moving on to the second aspect of cycles, Abdu'l-Baha speaks of those of religion, the spiritual cycles. Those of us who are students of the Baha'i writings are aware of how often material and spiritual explanations are counterpoints of a whole. I've noticed a series of twos in Baha'i literature: reward and punishment, the rulers and the learned. The faith even has two inseparable manifestations: Baha'u'llah and the Bab. Obviously, in speaking of the four material seasons, our physical sun is always in play. We may call our sun the orb of life, for Earth cannot exist without it. It is fascinating to note that our sun makes up 99.9% of all matter in the solar system. That fact alone proves its necessity and its importance. Abdu'l-Baha uses the sun of truth capitalized in his discussion of the spiritual cycle. Like the purpose of the physical sun to renew life on the planet, the spiritual sun of truth refers to the manifestations of God, charged with rekindling the life of the spirits with the light of his knowledge and teachings. The rays of this sun are meant to warm the hearts of its recipients and enlighten their souls. Abdu'l-Baha explains that the cycles of both the material and spiritual are similar. In the spiritual springtime, the sun of truth appears. Abdu'l-Baha speaks of spirits revived, hearts refreshed, souls refined, human realities rejoice and grow in attainments and perfections. Next come the fruitful summer. The word of God has been proclaimed. His laws are promulgated. His teachings reflect in actions. Civilization advances. not just from the descent of material benefits of the new cycle, but coupled with human refinement in following the fresh breezes of spiritual teachings and principles. With autumn and mankind's drifting away from the original intent of the Sun of Truth, the light of truth dims and a religious chill sets in. Abdu'l-Baha's description of this can be made into a list. Some on that list he mentions. Growth and development are arrested. Spiritual attractions vanish. Divine qualities decay. The radiance of the hearts is dimmed. The spirituality of the souls is dulled. Virtues become vices. Sanctity and purity are no more. And most critical to the list, of the law of God, naught remains but a name, and of the divine teachings, naught but an outward form. Next, of course, is this in the cycle comes the spiritual winter. Again, one can make a list from Abdu'l-Baha's picturing the state of humanity. The chill of ignorance and unawareness envelops the world. The darkness of wayward and selfish desires prevail. Apathy and defiance ensue, with indolence and folly, baseness and animal qualities. Then he says, when, however, the spiritual season has run its course, when, however, the winter season has run its course, the spiritual springtime returns again and a new cycle reveals its splendor. This, of course, necessitates the return of the Sun of Truth. And in this period, that is Baha'u'llah. Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the faith, wrote in God Passes By, the history of the first century of the Baha'i era, wrote, the Sun of Truth, the world's greatest luminary, had risen in the Sea of Shah of Tehran. And we all know the Sea of Shah is where Baha'u'llah was imprisoned and received the intimation of his revelation, beginning his 40-year ministry. The rest of chapter 14, about 3 pages, Abdu'l-Baha talks of another symbol, the zodiac signs, with the physical sun rising from different points. He said, one day it rises from the sign of Cancer, at another from the sign of Libra. One day it casts its rays from the sign of Aquarius, and another from that of Aries. Yet the sun is but one sun and one reality. To repeat his words, though the constantly moving sun passes through different heavenly signs, it is still the same sun. It is one. So Abdu'l-Baha explains, it is same with the spiritual Sun of Truth. At one time, it rises from the sign of Moses. At another time, the Sun of Truth sheds its rays from the sign of Christ, then the sign of Mohammed. Today, the spiritual rays descend from the sign of Baha'u'llah. They all, however, are one Sun of Truth. You will recall this familiar quote from the pen of Baha'u'llah, that the manifestations of God are all abiding in the same tabernacle, soaring in the same heaven, seated upon the same throne, uttering the same speech, and proclaiming the same faith. Then Abdu'l-Baha explains man's attachment to one sign, the point of its rising, instead of accepting the Sun of Truth as it moved from one after another of God's appointed signs, his manifestations, his vicegerents on earth. His words, especially in respect of man's search for the Sun of Truth in our studied chapter. Those who were searching after truth worshiped it wherever they saw it. But those who were attached to Abraham, when once that sun cast its rays upon Sinai and illumined the reality of Moses, were deprived thereof. And those who clung to Moses, when once the Sun of Truth shed its heavenly splendor in the fullness of its radiance from the point of Christ, were likewise veiled, and so forth. My concluding paragraph. Abdu'l-Baha elaborated on this theme of the worshiping of the sign and not the Sun of Truth as it moves through the spiritual heaven. We know that one of the major injunctions of Baha'u'llah is independent investigation of truth. In this respect, one short paragraph near the end of chapter 14 of Some Answered Questions, Abdu'l-Baha spoke in beautiful metaphors. Therefore, one must search after truth, become enraptured and enthralled with any sanctified soul in which one finds it, and become wholly attracted to the outpouring grace of God. Like the moth, one must be a lover of the light, in whatever lamp it may shine. And like a nightingale, one must be enamored of the rose, in whatever bower it may bloom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. That was absolutely wonderful. You really described chapter 13 and 14, but let's see if there are questions. Let's see. If anyone has any questions, please use the raise your hand feature or just wave.
Or comments.
Or comments. Yes, Bijan, please unmute yourself. Yeah, please unmute yourself, Bijan.
Okay, I guess my question is on chapter 13, on paragraph 12, that it says that they should feed her 3,203 score days.
And what does Abdu'l-Baha explain that those 3,000 are? You're reading from the book?
Right. I'm just reading the book and I just don't really understand what Abdu'l-Baha is referring to here.
Well, I have my book here, but I don't know if we want to take time to go through it. Is it on the same page as my book? I always have to read it before I can answer something accurately or as best I can.
Yeah, and I realize we are going to have possibly a different version because
Yes.
even Marianne, when you read that last paragraph, it was just a little bit different than the version we have. Bijan, could you just read the first few lines again of that paragraph?
Okay, sure. This is toward the end of that chapter 13, yeah. Like 4 paragraphs before that chapter 13 ends.
Right.
And it says that they should feed her there 1,203 score days. This
right.
is from the Bible.
Right, and I see that. It says verse 6, that they should feed her there 1,203 score days. And then right after it, it says, in the terminology of the Holy Book, these 1,260 days mean the 1260 years that the law of God was set up in the wilderness of Arabia, the great desert. So he first puts it in the quote and then he explains it.
And the
Yes, but-
three score, a score is 20 years.
Okay.
So
okay.
he's saying 1,203 scores, meaning 60 years,
Yeah, so
3 times 20. Yeah,
Great,
thank
thank
you
you. That
for-
was my question.
yeah, thank you for clearing that up.
Okay. Anyone else, please? And yes, thank you. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we are going to move on to chapter 15 with Mr. John Colstow. Thank you so much, Marianne. Oh, wait. Before we get to John, Dwayne, please ask your question. Hang on, Marianne, we got one for you. Unmute yourself, Dwayne, dear.
Well, actually, I wanted to read something from what he said. He said at the end of paragraph 6 of chapter 13, these humanoids, the first of whom was Abu Sufyan, the former chief of Mecca and founder of the dynasty, and the last of who was Marvin, destroyed a third of the holy and sanctified souls who descended from the pure lineage of Muhammad and were even as the stars of heaven. I looked that up, and it's true that Umayyads are said to have killed 4 imams. First Imam Abu Ali was not killed on the orders of Umayyad, but up to the fifth Imam, they were said to be killed on the orders of a Umayyad caliph. The Umayyads ruled until 750. The fifth Imam was killed in 732. The sixth Imam did not die until 765. It's over there in chat. You can see my comments in chat.
Okay, so what is your question, or are you just letting us know that?
I'll let you know that it's literally true that a third
Yeah.
of the stars of heaven were cast down.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you a
I looked
simple,
it up.
a simple explanation that I found, Dwayne, is I likened it to the Emperor Herod. When Herod was expecting the prophecy of the King of the Jews, which would be fearful for losing his own power, you remember that he heard about the 3 wise men who were Zoroastrians coming to pay homage to the baby Jesus who would become the Christ. And so what did Herod do? He killed all the babies under 2 years old in Nazareth, where Jesus was born. So in a way, you could say that this Emperor Herod was like the dragon with the tail. Now, in the quote, it says that the dragon was always waiting to devour the promised one, the babe who would be born from the bride, from the woman. So he didn't know, the dragon doesn't know when the birth is going to take place. So the dragon has been over centuries, over these 1,260 years, killing holy people. I looked it up on Wikipedia myself, and it was considered that the generals of the despotic caliphs and tyrannical kings killed holy expected descendants of the prophet. And that's the meaning of the tail swiping a third of the stars out of the heavens and smashing them to the earth. That's a simple explanation that I derived from thinking about both Christ and the dragon and the tail.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to